Welcome to the Cincinnati, USA Regional Chamber's Racial Equity Series. I'm Jill Meyer, the President and CEO, and I thank you for joining us. The Chamber has long prioritized inclusion in everything that we do, and we need to do more. Last week, we issued our endorsement for the state of Ohio, Hamilton counties, and the city of Cincinnati's impending resolutions to declare racism a public health crisis. Along with our endorsement, we are pushing for and committed to helping to bring about the actions needed throughout our community to address the inequities, both creating and resulting from this harsh reality. We also continue to prioritize our work already underway at the Chamber to address the insidious economic effects of racism. We continue to elevate and invest in the nationally leading work of our Minority Business Accelerator, our groundbreaking Workforce Innovation Center, and the array of programming in our Diverse by Design training and leadership offerings, like cultural competency for leaders. We're also adding new learning opportunities, like this Racial Equity Series, which is an extension of our Diverse by Design and Leadership Now virtual platform. These are strategies to reduce economic disparities that exist in our region as a result of racism. We see the stark current realities and understand the critical importance of creating inclusive workplaces, more minority-owned businesses, and more inclusive communities to help drive change. We believe that positive change is accelerated through education, tough discussions, courage, discomfort, and empathy. You do too. That's why you're here. Thank you for prioritizing your role in creating a more equitable Cincinnati region. We are grateful to BI3, Bethesda Inc.'s grant-making initiative to transform health, for sponsoring this series, and we're so happy that Bethesda Inc.'s president, Jill Miller, is here with us today. Thank you, Jill.
Thanks, Jill. BI3, Bethesda Inc.'s grant-making initiative to transform health, is proud to partner with the Chamber to bring you this Racial Equity Series to equip members of our business community with a better understanding of structural racism and the role they can play to build more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces and cultures. BI3 fuels collaborations and partnerships to disrupt the status quo and tackle the social, racial, and economic disparities to achieve equitable health outcomes. This is going to take strong leaders like you in all sectors to create change. But I believe in a day when every Cincinnatian has equal opportunity to achieve their highest level of health and well-being. And I want to personally thank you for coming on this journey with us.
Thank you for joining us today. I am Tommie Lewis, CEO and President of Make It Plain Consulting, and your moderator for today's discussion. We're very, very excited to have you join our conversation today. Our discussion is focused on what can I do? Understanding my personal responsibility in racial equity. And we're joined by panelists Sean Jeffers and Tracy Vroom. Thank you, Sean and Tracy, for being with us today. Our goal today is to ensure that this is interactive. However, we would like, if you don't mind, to place your device on mute to eliminate any background noise and or distractions. We're going to focus on uncovering our blind spots, how to have the courageous conversation, examine the question, diverse from what? And then also present some action items to do after the session. Again, I'm Tommie Lewis. I'm an African-American male, 50 years old, married, 4 children, and 9 grandchildren. I'm a former professional athlete and a student for life. In a previous life, I also was a chief diversity officer. That's just a little bit about me. I would like to welcome Sean and Tracy, beginning with Sean, to share a little bit about yourself, Sean, and then some of your personal identities that will help us frame our conversation for today.
Well, thank you, Tommie, and thank you for the Chamber for hosting today's event. So I'm Sean Jeffers. I'm the Director of Youth at the Center, and our work is really about challenging that old adage of children should be seen and not heard. We want to flip that on its head, and we want young people to be seen, heard, and valued. Both recognizing their leadership style and also their identities. And a lot of times it's adults, us grown-ups, that have to do better sometimes at being able to see where young people are. So that's a lot of our work, is working with youth and adults about how we can move that work forward. The salient identities that I bring with me today is I'm a white male, I'm gay, I'm 40 years old, and I work in the nonprofit sector.
Thank you, Sean. Tracy.
Good morning, or rather afternoon, everyone. I'm Tracy Vroom, and I am a Black woman. I was born in the United States, but my family is from Ghana, West Africa. So I am culturally African American in every sense. I'm a recovering attorney. I practiced employment law for many years. And I found that after litigating, applying, fighting for many of the 1960s civil rights laws, that workplaces haven't gotten far enough on our goals of where we'd like to be when it comes to creating inclusive environments and equitable environments that really foster diversity. I am a mindfulness practitioner and teacher. I've been a daily meditator for over 10 years. And I'm a soon-to-be new mom. My husband and I are expecting our first child in October. So that really does frame up the way that I see, as many of you can imagine, what the world is going to look like for my child.
Again, thank you, Tracy and Sean. This is an interactive learning, interactive conversation. And again, if you don't mind placing your device on mute, and at any point, share your comments, questions, thoughts, or feedback using the chat room. So let's practice that right now. Just to level set our conversation, we want to define this topic that we're talking about, race, racism, equity, or equality. In the chat box, if you would, write down how you would define any of those four areas: race, racism, equality, and equity. You can go ahead and type those into the chat room. Race is a social construct that we know around people, identifying people demographically, right? We know that racism is a system or process that may prohibit from access to food, shelter, clothing, opportunities, housing, even the pursuit of equality. All of these things are important. We'd love to get your insights. But one of the things we want to talk about today, and Sean and Tracy are going to speak to this so well, is that we all have blind spots. And those blind spots are unconscious or implicit biases. And some of those biases are actions that we know are happening. Some of them are things that we don't know. And again, if you don't mind placing your device on mute to eliminate any background noise, we do appreciate it. So in theory, that's all good, in theory, but in practice, personally. Sean, Tracy, could you share any of your personal stories where there were blind spots of your own or blind spots of others that have impacted you and the way you've lived your life?
Yeah, I'll take that on first. So one of the blind spots that I noticed in the last several years was this collusion with this idea of white fragility, this idea that white people can't take me as me, and therefore I should not wear my hair natural in its natural state, or I should change my African American idiom, cadences, clothing, in order to keep from triggering defenses from white people who may find me and my authentic personality and self to be to find defense in that, in order to fight that, in order to make them feel more comfortable. And that was a blind spot for me because I did it quite automatically without really realizing that that's what I was engaging in. Over time, I've really begun to understand that I was robbing not only myself of my ability to present myself authentically, and therefore stop wasting the energy on having to code switch, some call it, but also that I was robbing the interaction of the richness of diversity that could come from presenting myself as authentic. I also have a story about a professional blind spot that I experienced as well. Would you like me to go into that, Tommie?
Sure, feel free. We'll come to you afterwards, Sean.
So and back in 2015, there was a woman who died in the custody of the police. Her name was Sandra Bland. And at the time, I was working in an organization, and she died over the weekend. Her experiences, you may recall, were that she was coming from a job interview, pulled over by a police officer, and a day later, after being arrested, was found in her jail cell. This happened over a weekend, and the news had developed, and I experienced a great deal of personal sadness over what happened because I identified very strongly with this young woman. When I went to work that Monday, and was asked how was my weekend, I realized that my organization had not established the psychological safety needed for me to be able to say honestly, my weekend was terrible. I had experienced secondhand trauma through this woman's death, and psychological place to really engage in kind of small talk at the office. I think a blind spot that organizations have is that lack of psychological safety for these very difficult conversations that we need to have, especially when it comes to racialized trauma.
Yeah. Thank you, Tracy, very, very much for your personal and candid reflection on how hidden biases and unconscious bias, all that has impacted you. Sean?
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. And so I would say for me, as a white man, my blind spot was probably the first 22 years of my life. I grew up in Mason. I went to Miami. Not necessarily either of those are known for their diverse bastions. And I think had an experience in 2002 where I went to the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force Creating Change Conference. And the theme that year was called Building an Anti-Racist Movement. And the very first activity we did was everyone on your name tag had like a breakout room you were going to, and walked into the room, and the moderator of our breakout room was just like, gonna have everyone go around, similar to what Tommie had us do today, just go around and say the identities that you have. And I, just by nature of where I sat, was only a couple people away from the moderator. So the first person was like, I'm a Korean American and gay, and just like had all these things. And I was like sitting there and I was like, do I say I'm white? Do I say I'm Dutch? Do I say I'm European American? Like, I don't even know like what to say. And I think it was that idea of like, other than like circling a box on a Scantron for like a standardized test or something, hadn't really thought about it. And that was only 20 years ago, that there wasn't really this conversation oftentimes around how that plays out. But I think that experience really started to help me think about like, that when we hear the word race, it's not just a synonym of Black, or of Black, Indigenous, people of color, like, you know, but it's recognizing that all of us have a race, all of us have a gender, all of us have a sexual orientation somewhere on that spectrum, and recognizing those pieces. And so I think that was one important piece that played out. I think the other piece that's been really important was a program I got to do, an AmeriCorps program called Public Allies. And Public Allies, as part of its program, did a power and privilege series where every month, like during one of our training days, we would look at race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ability, religion, and explore how these things played out. And then I went on to be the director and was on staff of that program. And so as I would do these trainings, the things I kept hearing from people is like, Public Allies has ruined the ability for me to just sit and watch TV. Because now I'm watching TV and I'm looking at, like, wait, why are they making that character do that? Like, why is that, why is this happening? And I was like, and that's part of sometimes recognizing that, like, we were operating with a blind spot because we were able to be in that ignorance is bliss kind of space. And now have actually been confronted with having to think about, like, why some of the choices and some of the decisions that are made, and then thinking about how does that play out for us. So those are a couple examples, I think, for me about how things started to be on my radar. And I will just close by saying, I think Brian Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy, he talks a lot about how we have to be proximate to the issues in order to solve and address the issues. And I think when we have blind spots, we can't get proximity to those dynamics. And so somebody said they weren't able to understand, I'm not sure about the TV, but I think sometimes characters, just when you're watching TV or movies, it can seem that like characters are being written in very stereotypical ways, that I think people were starting to recognize that, and that was challenging them. So
Yeah, that's a great call out, Sean, and I appreciate the comments for clarity, questions or concerns. Feel free. What I'm hearing is that with blind spots and this topic of racial equity, there may be some discomfort with some people and maybe more comfort with others. I personally believe that it takes courage to speak up, to identify blind spots, to identify behaviors that are driven from blind spots. And then I also know that sometimes we have to be mindful in ourselves to around self-awareness to know, you know, what are our blind spots, and be receptive to the feedback from others that call out our blind spots. I want to turn to Tracy because I believe, Tracy, you have an outstanding exercise that will help us become maybe a little more comfortable with this conversation and actually work through our mindfulness in the process of discomfort. Can you kind of walk us through the exercise?
Absolutely. So the question, what we experience around these conversations about rage trigger emotions, and emotions can trip us up. Tommie, I agree with you wholeheartedly in that we have to develop resiliency for these conversations, and that will foster the courage to continue. How do we develop that resiliency? We begin to acknowledge, as a lifetime practitioner of meditation and mindfulness, I found that the best place to start is within our own bodies. So when we're triggered, we have these fight, flight, and freeze responses. And that is, you know, for instance, in the conversations about racial inequity, we may confront a conversation about race and fight. We engage in outrage Olympics. I'm more outraged than you about this. We fight, we avoid, we go into flight. We avoid the conversation by deflection, by figuring out a way to just get out of it. Or we freeze, we shut down, where we are physically present, but our mind is mentally checked out of the conversation. In order to really establish the courageous conversations that Sean is going to take us through later, we're going to have to find a way to become rooted in our discomfort in such a way that we can engage in really meaningful conversation. So how do we do that? Let's have a guided practice where I'm going to ask you to identify with, I'm going to break this up into people who live in white bodies and people who live in Black bodies. And it's not to be exclusive to any other identification, but since our country has historically created this idea of race, really as a dichotomy between the Black body and white body, that's where we're going to start. So for Black bodies, we're going to do a short exercise. I want you to think through this. Recall an incident when you deliberately or willfully altered your behavior to protect a white body. So this is not where you were paid or asked or told to do so, but rather where, as a Black man, perhaps you crossed the street preemptively when you saw a white woman approaching you. Or the example I gave earlier, you changed the cadence or the idioms that you use in a conversation with someone who was living in a white body in order to make them feel comfortable. Now, bringing that to mind, I want you to ask yourself some questions. Did the soothing or protecting of the white body work in that instance? Was it effective? Could the person have soothed or protected themselves in that situation? How would the outcome have been different if you did not engage in the soothing or protecting behavior? And finally, are you glad you did it? Now, having thought about those questions, what are you experiencing in your body right now? Are you experiencing relaxation? Are you experiencing constriction? Just note that. Now, I want you to come back to the present, orient yourself. This is an exercise we'll do a couple of times later when we have more of this discussion. I want you to look to your left. I want you to look to your right. I want you to look behind you, which you may not have to do because you have a camera. I want you to look ahead of you, and I want you to root yourself in your safety. You are safe. For white bodies, I'd invite you to this exercise, this visualization. You're invited to a Black coworker's wedding reception. Now, you're a bit late, so most people have already arrived. And you scan the room and you realize that in over 300 people in the room, you're the only non-Black person in the room. Even the servers are Black. What are you experiencing in your body? Notice any constriction. Notice any relaxation. Now, someone comes to you in this visualization exercise, an older Black relative, and says to you, how you feeling, and tries to bring you, some comfort in that moment. What do you experience then? Did you need that? Now, what thoughts are going through your head? You too. Now I'd like you to root yourself back in the present. Look to your left, look to your right, look behind you and ahead of you. You are safe. The purpose of these exercises is to get you to feel your discomfort and what you're experiencing and become familiar with these experiences so that when you're triggered in the moment, you don't run away from your discomfort, but rather root yourself in your discomfort, become familiar with it, and therefore don't allow yourself to react in the way that we would typically react in that fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. Instead, we root ourselves, we know that we are safe, and we are prepared to engage.
Tracy, once again, I thought that was a fantastic exercise. And I want to remind everyone in this conversation that to continue to share your comments and your thoughts in the chat room, but also remember why we're here. Again, we're here to answer the question, what can I do? It's my personal responsibility in racial equity. It's not about anyone else. We're taking personal accountability. So the exercise in my mind allowed us to focus on ourselves and what we experience, feel. I thought it was a great exercise to slow down, to be reflective in self. Sean, we've known each other for some time. I've always enjoyed our conversations, particularly with your knowledge and insights with regards to courageous conversations. If you don't mind, can you talk with us about courageous conversations? Kind of walk us through what that looks like and sounds like.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Tommie. And in a second, we'll bring up a slide. One observation I just want to name that I think is important. And Tracy, thank you for doing that meditation exercise with us. But if you notice the framing even that Tracy brought out, she said to the Black people in the room, I want you to think about an experience where this happened. To the white people in the room, I want you to imagine if this happened. And the dynamic oftentimes is that for white folks, we sometimes have to imagine maybe being the only white person in the room. And that for most Black, Indigenous people of color, they know what it's like oftentimes to be the only person in the room. And so that's also sometimes when we think about having courageous conversations, that we have to think about what does it really look like for us to show up into having these conversations. And so, so there's a great book called Courageous Conversations About Race, a field guide for having equity in schools. And so we've kind of adapted and added some of our own. And so it's on the screen and we're just gonna kind of walk through and share a couple of these. So the first is to stay engaged. Do whatever it is you need to do to be present in a conversation, not just physically engaged, but also think about mentally and emotionally engaged in that conversation. The second is to speak your truth. And this is about talking your lived experience, what has authentically happened to you, and bringing that out. It is very easy when we're getting together to have conversations about race or identity to think about, well, those people over there are more racist or are less accepting than us, and sometimes pat ourselves on the back because of assuming that. And so when we start to have that groupthink or celebrating ourselves, we're not really speaking our truth. We're kind of more avoiding the work. So when we speak our truth, it's bring what has happened to you, what has been your experience, and bring that to the conversation. The next is experience discomfort. So if Tommie speaks his truth, and Tommie and I are in a courageous conversation, we're having a dialogue about race, Tommie speaks his truth, Tommie and I have lived very different lives. And so sometimes in this experience discomfort, we just say, pause, think about what maybe somebody said that was different than what we've experienced, maybe caused us to feel a little differently in that. And so that experience discomfort is sometimes just sit with it for a minute and reflect and then respond from that place. Next is grant amnesty, honor confidentiality. Grant amnesty is really a nice way of saying don't hate on folks for things said in a learning space. Give grace. Assume people are coming to conversations with the best of intentions. And with that being said, when we show up for conversations, actually have good intentions in those spaces. And so sometimes people hear speak your truth and they're like, well, I'm allowed to say whatever comes to my mind. But think about how we're really showing up authentically. The other piece of that is honor confidentiality. Anytime you're in a conversation with other individuals, take the learning, but unless someone has expressly given you permission to share their personal story, don't share those. Don't share names or someone's personal story because that can ruin the trust or the vulnerability. Expect and accept that there won't be closure, right? Like we have an hour today. We know last year the New York Times did the 1619 Project that highlighted just the 400 years of enslavement in America. We know these things have been going on for centuries, so we're not going to wrap it up. Sometimes in professional settings, we've been put through diversity training, which has kind of been somebody from maybe HR and all love to my HR friends out there, but somebody from HR comes in and for 1 hour is like, here's what we need to do to be nice to the Black people, be nice to the gay people, please don't get our company sued, and please sign this paper that you've heard this. And so we sometimes think about this as being like something you get put through or just have to endure, versus when we really think about expect and accept non-closure, we know that there's more questions than answers. There's more research, more understanding, more knowledge, more conversations to happen so that we can be better informed. And the last is to have fun doing serious things, is that nothing we do not enjoy do we commit time for. So if we see having courageous conversations or talking about race as a burden, as something we just have to get through, then we're going to be happy when it's over and never look at it again. If we have fun doing serious things, we can lean in, we can appreciate the connection, the humanity that we have with one another, and do this work. It's hard work. It can be draining work, but if we have a little bit of fun, if we find that humanity in each other, it can be really powerful. And then I think there's one more slide to just share how this plays out with courageous conversations in, there we go, thank you. Cool, so this highlights as well just a way courageous conversations can happen. And one key thing is that sometimes when we have a prompt, we read a news story, we scrolling through social media and we see something, we can sometimes go to one of four places. We can go to a moral place. We just see something and we have a reaction that this is in my gut, not right. An intellectual place where we start to think about like, well, why did something like that happen? What's the background? What's the history? What's the statistics, the data around that? We could go to a feeling or an emotional place where we're kind of, getting our feelings around, our response or thinking about what is happening. Or we can go to a social place. We see something and it was like, this isn't right. I need to go do something. I need to protest. I need to write a letter. I need to organize, do something. But the biggest thing that tends to happen is along this diagonal between the emotional and the intellectual is that when we're closer to something, when something is about our identities or we're more proximate to the issue, it's just natural that it's going to feel a little bit more emotional because there's a little bit more ownership and connection to it. And if we're in a more privileged situation or a little bit more of an intellectual position, sometimes we're a little bit more removed, a little bit more detached. It's easier to sometimes think about things rationally. So when we're having courageous conversations, to notice and name that piece. That if I'm having a conversation with Tracy and she tells me she had this experience where she talked about going into her law firm and no one, had the thoughtfulness about thinking about, how she might be feeling over Sandra Bland, that intellectually I could be like, well, do you really think they meant it that way? Do you think this? And so sometimes in that intellectual place, we can more be looking at that. And so I just want to put out there, in the great history of dialogues that have happened, never has, I think you're making too big a deal of this, ever helped the situation. Just wanted to say that one, that has never helped improve the situation, but just sometimes recognize when we're intellectual in a place, that's a potential for us to maybe have a blind spot. And sometimes it's important for us to listen, but make sure that we still engage, we're speaking our truth, and hearing where others are coming from. So those are some tools and tips to think about how we can engage in meaningful, courageous conversations.
Again, thank you, Sean. I want to ask both you, Sean, and Tracy to help me out. Help me out. I'm experiencing a little frustration, not only now, but in recent months and also in years, to be honest, my entire life. And that frustration is around the challenge of minimizing, people minimizing. In other words, I've heard comments from folks, good intentioned people that would say things like, why can't we all just get along? In full transparency, I felt the same way. Why can't we all just get along? Or, all lives matter. Kind of minimizing a statement that either Black Lives Matter or another person or group of people's lives matter, or even the comment, I see everyone the same. I'm frustrated because as I identified myself unapologetically, I am an African American man. I would like people to see that, and I also would like people to respect that, as if I am respecting, not as if, but I'm respecting that their identity for themselves. Can you all help me out, and maybe others that are grappling with the ideal and the speak of minimizing, how it impacts us, how it is perpetuated through speech, maybe even action, and definitely in thought, when people want to minimize one's identity, one's experience, one's act of being. Can you talk to that a little bit?
JC, do you want to go?
Sure. It's a frustration that I share, and the silence initially in addressing it. It's because it's a frustration that I share. It comes from very nuanced places about who we are as humans. We all want to be good people. We all want to be good people, and deep down, we really do believe in a very idealistic sense. At the same time, we are not practiced at having difficult conversations in general, not just conversations around race, but conversations around emotions, conversations around, things that are not necessarily corporate in that sense. So we tend to gravitate towards sound bites in order to deflect conversations. It's just another one of our trigger responses to being triggered. And I think what you said originally, Tommie, and what Sean has expanded on by talking about courageous conversations, is that we begin to practice within ourselves, within our smaller families, within our smaller communities, diving in fearlessly, or even with the fear and doing it anyway, into conversations that are difficult, developing language around being able to say, you know what, I am having a hard time with this. And also just being able to listen and not having to have a response or thinking we're gonna, as Sean just explained, tidy everything up in one conversation.
Yeah, that's well said. Sean, any thoughts?
Yeah, so thank you, Tracy, for that. And I think building on that is, I think there's sometimes this worry about disagreeing or not all being on the same. And so I think one of the things we did today, which was intentional, was Tommie asked us, and we each shared, what are the identities we're bringing in? And we named that. And sometimes that can be helpful about what are the perspectives that we're bringing in. And sometimes that minimization can be about, how do we ignore the differences? And we maybe say things like, well, we're all part of the human race, or I don't see race. And I think those can be really hurtful, because that can say, I don't see parts of people's core identities about who they are. And so I think that's an important part of how we do this work, is recognizing that sometimes we do have different backgrounds, we have different experiences. We know that in, just in Cincinnati, right? Like the zip code you were born into is going to determine a lot around the opportunities and the experiences that you have. And so we have to name those things sometimes and to have that conversation. And so I think like one quick example I will share is we were facilitating, and this is in one of the AmeriCorps programs that we were facilitating a training, and one of the white participants said, like, I don't see race. And one of the Black participants was like, are you telling me you don't see this? You don't see all of this? And so it was just like a moment of like, I'm here. Like, you can take it or leave it, but I'm here. And I think sometimes, like, when people are engaging in conversations, they have to say some things that make maybe make people a little uncomfortable, to push past that to get to us actually addressing like what's at the crux of this that we can work on to help our organization, help our communities be more welcoming and inclusive.
Yeah, I think, again, conversation is rich and dynamic. A shout out to all of our watchers and listeners sharing comments in the chat room. You are fully engaged in this conversation around racial equity. This is so encouraging. And thank you, Sean and Tracy, for fielding my frustration, maybe others. I read a couple of quotes or comments with people adding not only 2 cents, but maybe even a dime or a quarter of wisdom and insights. Folks are investing in the next steps toward racial equity. What can I do? In that, we are talking about equity, and oftentimes companies, civic organizations, communities have been grappling with this ideal called diversity. So I want to kind of throw it to you, Tracy. Kind of walk us through these steps. Diverse from what, right? Diverse from what? We have our historical biography of this country. We had a lot of diversity, not a lot of diversity, a big push for diversity, a kind of a plateau of diversity. What are we talking about when we say diverse from what?
Yes, and I'd like to jump into a slide I've prepared for this part of the conversation as well. So diverse from what is a question that we can only, with an honest response, that we can only get to after we have gone through some, I would say, work. Because who are we centering when we say diverse? We're looking for workplace diversity. Who are we centering? Where are we getting diversity from what exactly? Who is on the periphery of that conversation when we say we're looking for diversity? Now, let's keep that question in mind as we go through a step-by-step process to how can we get to some honest conversations in our organizations about what we mean when we say we are looking to create a more diverse workplace. So the first thing we need to do is acknowledge and abandon our certitudes around our knowledge of race and racial equity. We all come to these conversations with a certain amount of knowledge, as Tommie mentioned, or Sean rather, that some of us have gone through diversity training and kind of checked the box. Yep, I know everything there is to know about this and I'm good, I get to go along my merry way. But we have to interrupt that pattern. And we have to interrupt the pattern of thinking that we know the answers so that we can just get to the solutions. In order to get to the solutions, we really have to be willing to say, I don't know the answers. So I put the fish in this slide because it reminds me of an allegory where there are two fish swimming along. A third fish comes upon them and says, "Good afternoon, fellas. How's the water today?" He continues to swim along, and the two other fish continue on their way. And one asks the other, "What's water?" We have to accept the fact that when it comes to race, we are in water and we don't even know it. There's so many blind spots and areas where we are swimming in racial inequity and white body supremacy, and we don't even know it. So our work is to uncover what that means, not only systemically, but also personally. The second thing that we are going to tackle before we get to the honest answer of diverse from what is eliminating what I've come to adopt a term called piteous empathy and instead embracing the work. So in the 60s, what we saw was a movement that was certainly affected, widely applauded, but came from piteous empathy. It was racial equity for the Black people. We were doing the work for the Blacks, to help out the Blacks. Rather than pity, in order to get to the optimistic place that we're looking to go for sustained organizational cultural change, we're going to need to employ the tools of belonging, empathy, and relationship. That's a much longer conversation. And we'll provide some tools. I saw folks talking about the exercise that I did earlier and asking for that exercise to be provided. I'll provide that exercise along with some other resources that we can use to continue these conversations to get to where we're looking to go. The second reason we're embracing the work is because this is not just about social justice. In our organizations, we're talking about profit motives. So in 2016, Microsoft released a racist chatbot called Tay. It took millions of dollars to develop this AI, but Microsoft had to shut it down within 16 hours because Twitter trolls taught the AI to be racist. Second example, Starbucks, back in 2018, had to shut down its stores nationwide, lost $16 million in profit in order to engage in racial equity training across the country. Third example, in 2015, Google came under fire because its image recognition technology began labeling Black people as gorillas. Now, who do you think was missing in those leadership rooms and in those at those thinking tables when these technologies were coming into use? I also want you to think about, with those examples in your own organizations, what perspectives, experiences, and backgrounds may be missing from your table. And then think about what backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives may be missing in the context of race. So this is not about pity. This is about doing the work because we want to develop belonging, empathy, and relationship, and we also want to create profitable business models. Third, we're going to have to become honest and mindful. We did this earlier, but let's talk about this a little bit more, about white body trauma reactions and Black body trauma reactions. So what tools help us to become more mindful about our trauma reactions? And the trauma reactions we discussed are, we have a collective trauma response to racism. We fight, we flee, we freeze, or we do what some say, which is, rather than open ourselves up, we rather say, we've done all the work, we understand, and that's it, rather than understanding this work to be a lifelong process. So another tool for white bodies, in order to become more familiar with your trauma reactions, I would challenge you to attend a Black church or a mosque, a African dance performance or a hip hop performance, a Black theater troupe performance, a musical performance. And the next two, honestly, this is harder to do in person, obviously, because of COVID. We're unable to have these experiences in person. But yet, I challenge you to find a way to immerse yourself in an environment that's a Black environment. And in that experience, I want you to periodically pause and pay attention to your body. What are you experiencing? What thoughts and urges are arising? pay attention to your body moment by moment. This is not a cultural immersion exercise. This is about noticing your body in real time. And for Black bodies, at work or at places where you find yourself in an environment where you are the only Black body in that space, I want you to root yourself in that, in your safety. Be present, orient yourself the way that we did, looking to your left, your right, behind you, in front of you, rooting your safety. And after we have these practices, after we've eliminated the piteous empathy, we've done the work around the trauma reactions, and we've eliminated our sense that we know everything about these topics, then we can start to really uncover the answer to the conversation, which it's a longer conversation than what we're having today. So what are we saying diverse from? Diverse from what? That's what I have.
Excellent. Thank you, Tracy, very much so. And we are approaching the top of the hour. I want to, again, thank you all for hanging in with us, joining this conversation, sharing your thoughts in the chat room. I wanted to ask all of us, and then kind of throw to Tracy and Sean for your kind of your verbal recommendations. If you would, in the chat room, type in some of the resources that we could use or reference to address racism, systemic racism, inequality, inequity. And so if there's a book, an article, a website, any of this, begin to type those in for us to capture. Then we'll share those later to everyone. Again, put your thinking caps on here. We're looking to share resources that will help us directly address these ills, these concerns that's been around for a long time. I would also add, before I throw it to Sean and Tracy, that there's going to become a time that we will have to transition from the theoretical and academic perspective and really have that tough conversation. To talk like people talk, to engage as we engage, right? Because it's great when it's in theory, the they or the those, but when it's personal, then there's a lot of emotion that's tied to it, and then the conversation changes. And so, Sean, Tracy, if there were only one or two recommendations, resources that you would like to offer up to us, what would those one or two be?
First, I'd like to acknowledge what you said about the need and where we're going to go with having these conversations on a much more personal level, being able to say, this is my experience, this is how I experience the world. One of the things that did that for me was actually a podcast called Seeing White. And that podcast series, I think it's a 7-part series available on most podcast networks, really opened my eyes to a lot of my own blind spots around what whiteness was and the construct that created it. The second one is the book from which I developed and drew many of the mindfulness practices that we engaged in today. It's called My Grandmother's Hands by an author, a social psychologist, named Resma Menakem. And you'll find that he's a perfect kind of counterbalance to Robin DiAngelo's work, A White Fragility.
Sean?
Yeah, so one, and I'll put this in the chat, one tool, based on the chart I showed earlier, sometimes white people, when we are engaging in conversations around race, we can approach it very intellectually and not think that we look at race in an emotional way. And there's a fantastic article put out through the Unitarian Universalists that has an anti-racism series called The Emotional Lives of White People, and explores like what are some of the emotions, whether that's guilt or shame or anger, denial that white people can sometimes go through. And I think that can really help us think about how we can show up at level set in the conversations. The other two pieces I want to share are not necessarily resources, but I think are actions you can take. And I think one action is there's a fantastic activity sometimes you can do called making a mental checklist. I saw in the chat, and I think it was a great comment, somebody said, like, can we ever address true equity until we really address our racial past? And I don't think we can, because so many of our systems and structures were built on white supremacy. And until we really think about that, there's going to continue to be aspects of that. But we also can't start to change what we don't notice. And so an activity can sometimes be mental checklist. And this can say, based on any of the identities you hold, where you maybe have a more privileged aspect or a more advantaged aspect, to start saying, what are some things that I can maybe write down to say, am I noticing? You know, sometimes it can be something as simple as who's not at the table. When we're having conversations, are the people impacted by this decision? Are they in the room? I work a lot with young people, as I said, school boards, all sorts of groups of adults that get together, make decisions about young people, totally absent of young people. And that continues to happen. And there's a lot of ways this plays out. The other tool and action you can take is called amplifying. In the Obama administration, women in the Obama administration did this thing where they felt like they would throw out ideas, they weren't picked up, and then some man would say the same thing, and suddenly it would be like, oh yeah, we got to do that. And so women started doing this thing of amplifying, where they would hear somebody and say, what I just heard Tracy say was this. And somebody else would be, yeah, I heard that and I really like that idea too, Tracy. And so it would be this practice. And so anytime there is individuals who are not as represented or haven't historically been represented at your tables, that practice of amplifying can really be powerful about helping make sure their voices get centered and not that their ideas get stolen or taken for others' benefits. And so I think those are two things, that mental checklist of just writing down those questions that I can think about, I can ask myself, and then things I can do is amplifying those voices, be that megaphone in settings, are two things I would share.
I know I've said it maybe 3 or 4 times in our conversation today. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with Sean Jeffers, Tracy Vroom. For those who don't know these scholar activist people, obviously we can have the deep dive conversation, but these two people can also laugh. In this conversation, sometimes we do have to smile and laugh because we can get too deep and too bogged down and too stressed. And it's okay to talk about race and equity. It's okay. And that's part of this conversation as a community. And so I want to personally and professionally thank Sean and Tracy for joining in this conversation, sharing, as I mentioned before, not just 2 cents or a dime, but maybe a quarter. And sometimes you all shared a whole dollar bill, right? Gave a dollar bill of insights and knowledge. Thank you both so much, very much. And if you want to share your thank yous to Sean in the chat room or Tracy in the chat room, please do so. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce and to bring up Senior Director of Sales and Engagement of the Chamber, and a delightful energy, delightful person and professional, Beth McNeil. Beth, if you're with us, if you would, come forth and share.
Thank you, Tommie. Thank you, Sean and Tracy, for all sharing your time and expertise with us today. Special thanks also to our sponsor in this series, BI3, Bethesda Inc.'s grant-making initiative to transform health. I'm glad to share that the Chamber is launching a membership campaign with a variety of incentives and benefits. And one incentive that we have is the opportunity to give the gift of membership. Companies and individuals are able to gift a membership to a small MBE for only $400 that will be good all the way through 2021. So if you're leaving the conversation today and you're saying, I want to make a difference, please consider the gift of membership. Additionally, there's a wide range of cost savings programs provided by our 11 partners, some of which are Shakely, Humana, and Office Depot. We're proud to have those 11 partners serving our members. And members have used our group buying power benefits to save nearly $22 million on everyday expenses. So today, several partners have actually enhanced the cost savings offers that they have for our members. So please go onto our website and look for those special initiatives from our partners, because they are time sensitive. And we hope that you found value in the program today. Programming, like you saw today, is one of the many benefits of membership. And going forward, this racial equity series will be available exclusively to members. So today's session was open and welcome to all, but going forward, the remaining sessions will be available exclusively to members. So if you're interested in learning more about membership, becoming a member, or maximizing your membership benefits, please reach out to our membership team at 513-579-3111, or just go to cincinnati-chamber.com/membership. We'd love to hear from you. If you're a member, we'd love to get you further engaged. If you're not a member and a future member, we'd love to talk to you all about the benefits of membership. So thank you again from the Cincinnati USA Regional Chamber. And we hope you tune in for the rest of the series. And as we log off today, please remember, wear your mask, stay safe, stay connected, be encouraged, and learn what you use today in this discussion to make a difference in our community. Thank you.